if you will, tonight. So this presentation on perennial vegetables tends to cover one of the main topics that we tend to get a lot of questions about at the University of Illinois Extension Office. As great as these grow, and they grow very successful, sometimes there are challenges that you encounter. This is also a group of vegetables where, because they're the first ones to emerge in the springtime, it's one that I think a lot of folks are very much interested in finding out how they can grow these and add to their backyard setting too, which is why we've kind of brought them all together in tonight's topic. So you were given the handouts earlier today via the email, and I'll also make sure that Nikki can share that in the chat box for you if you'd like to view tonight's presentation as I go along. So here's tonight's plan. We'll kind of get a general overview about kind of what these perennial vegetables are, most of which you're pretty familiar with, and yet want to cover some of those basics, as you maybe consider planting perennial vegetables for the first time. We know there's a lot of growers that either became new vegetable growers last summer or, have decided to return to vegetable gardening. And this might be one of those that you're curious about, and perhaps you just didn't have the time last year to consider planting these. So we'll get into some general overviews of things that you need to consider when it comes to this perennial vegetable group. And then we're going to break it down to the big three. This is rhubarb, this is asparagus, and this is horseradish. Those are going to be the main three that we're going to really concentrate and talk about tonight. And I will state that most of the time it's going to be rhubarb and asparagus. They kind of have equal footing, but we will, of course, want to address horseradish too. There's a number of other vegetables that are kind of out there that you might have potential to either grow as a perennial or with some troubleshooting, or it may just take some time. I think one of the great benefits of having a backyard or a community garden plot is sometimes you get to experiment. That's at least what I like to do. So I'll go into a couple that I've had some experiments with, if you will, experimenting with, particularly globe artichoke, which I grew last summer, and I'm in a stage of trying to assess whether it's become perennial or not, which I'll explain a little more what I mean there. We'll also mention sunchokes as well as rams too. And then kind of our last group is a lot of troubleshooting. You're going to see a number of photos of rhubarb and asparagus that's taken from our Winnebago County Extension Office. We have some in the backyard at that location. We also have some in other locations in our unit as well. And so you see there our rhubarb patch, which is, this is very small at this point compared to sometimes what it looks like. You're also going to see tonight a number of asparagus photos. We're very fortunate at University of Illinois Extension to have an educator who does a lot of work in asparagus varieties in Southern Illinois. And he has graciously provided me with a lot of photos of asparagus and talked about some of the varieties that he's grown and some of the things that he really likes about them too. So you'll see a lot of those photos tonight as well. All right, so at the end of the day, what's a perennial vegetable? It's one that's going to come back year after year. It's one that you are planting, say in 2021, you're giving it all of the things that it needs, such as space and compost, aged manure, fertilizer, just things like that. And it's going to keep growing and keep coming back season after season with usually some annual growth. And the annual growth is typically what's going to be harvested from the actual perennial vegetable. And that's what you see here with asparagus, that the actual perennial part of asparagus is underground. And every single season, the annual growth that is coming up is the asparagus spears that we're very familiar with and we harvest from. This group tends to be the first spring vegetables most season. This asparagus, rhubarb are kind of our main two that tend to emerge once they have been established after a couple of years. And they have a very long harvest window. In Northern Illinois, what we encounter is that this harvest period can sometimes be, depending on the year and the age of the plant, sometimes 6 to 8 weeks, sometimes even a little bit longer than that. And typically we see this harvest period begin sometimes mid-April and even in the last, even upcoming week, we start to see this harvest period begin. And it tends to last until mid-June, typically in most seasons. The one feature that most of these have is they need establishment years. So compared to, say, tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, those where you would be planting them in a single season, you would be getting yields from them that year, and then it'd be over with. These are ones where you would be planting this season and you would not be harvesting from. And then the next year, say 2022, you might be harvesting for 1 to 2 weeks. And then in 2023, you might be harvesting for 4 to 5 weeks. So it really depends, of course, on what perennial vegetable we're talking about, but they need establishment years to build up and develop that rhizome under the ground. This group is also one that has minimal yearly maintenance. We might consider that when it comes to what their needs are in the growing season as it gets started, it maybe is just addressing it by adding compost or even adding some manure in the fall, but allowing them to have their space, and don't really see too many challenges here with this as far as the yearly maintenance that this group really needs. So as we think about these opportunities here with perennial vegetables, with our rhubarb and our asparagus, they're just a really great complement to annual vegetables. I think that's one thing where we start to see that the temperatures start to warm up and are ready to get outside. And here are two vegetables that are just really springing up from that soil and really taking off. And it's just a great complement to any vegetables that you might be growing. It may also be something to consider too if you're thinking of selling at farmers markets, that because these are going to yield the earliest for you compared to a lot of our other cool season annual crops like beets, radish, and spinach, you might be able to really offer these at a farmer's market stand. And then gradually, as the harvest ends for these, move into those other cool season vegetables to harvest from. So it really complements the vegetables that you might be growing. These, of course, also grow exceptionally well in the Midwest. They really thrive in the conditions that we have, and the soils that we have, and then the environment that we really have with these. Most of them have very few insect and disease problems. I'll mention one insect later on tonight on asparagus. And we, of course, can sometimes talk potentially if you've encountered some disease problems previously, but we see minimal issues in most cases with this group. Harvest is also kind of ending toward the end of June, which I think works really well for their warm season and your cool season plants, because you can now devote attention back to them after they have been planted most of the time. Yet again, not too needy. And I think one of the great benefits here, just regularly found at most home and garden centers and nurseries. I'd say if you talk to others about rhubarb, you would easily find people that were willing to give you rhubarb from their backyard as well, too. Whether it is they're harvesting it for you or they're actually giving you a cutting of the rhubarb plant so you can grow in the back. You see here, this is a photo of horseradish at the local nursery. It's situated right beside the asparagus plants. So what about the challenges? I've kind of set it up that these are great plants. Why aren't you growing them? And yet there are challenges with this group. They really need an undisturbed location in your growing area. Because they are going to have such a long life, it's very important that they are able to really thrive and able to really grow. So location is really crucial for this group, because it's going to take a number of years for them to establish underground. And then they also are going to live potentially 15, 20 years or more. In fact, I know there's a number of folks that have a family asparagus patch that is 30 years old. So you really need to think about an area that's going to remain undisturbed, that is also going to allow for these plants to really thrive. One of the other things to consider is that they may need to be managed after some time, especially the rhubarb is one where it needs to be divided. And you might look at dividing it at year 5 of its growth or a couple years after, but certainly it is something that's going to be required in order to have very good, vigorous rhubarb stalks for your plants. I think one of the other challenges with this group further is that there's very few cultivars available. And when I discuss availability, I'm sharing that, if you went to a home and garden center, you may not find 6 or 7 different varieties of rhubarb. You may find one. If you're looking for horseradish, you may just find one cultivar of horseradish at the home and garden center. And the same with asparagus. You're just not going to find as many kind of on a local basis. You may find that you may have to order some of these that you are really after and seeking. There's just very few cultivars available kind of locally compared to all of our other annual vegetables like tomatoes, eggplant, and so forth. They need establishment years, and it's very important that you establish them, but also be very mindful of not harvesting during those first couple of years. Tonight, we'll go into those 3 ones mentioned, the rhubarb, asparagus, and horseradish, and talk about that harvest those first initial years after planting. And you're going to find that this is going to be crucial to really do. And so that is one thing where if you're planting rhubarb this year, for instance, you're not going to be harvesting rhubarb this year. You're going to have a little harvest in 2022. You're going to have a little bit of a bigger harvest in 2023, but really you're looking forward at 2024, 2025 for some very good harvest years. This group also has physical soil and pH needs. And while that's true for most of the other vegetables that we might be growing in our summer vegetable garden or our cool season vegetable garden, this is a group that has such deep roots. Asparagus goes down sometimes 6 feet with its root system that it needs to be able to make its way down. What this means is that if you're thinking that you have a patch or an area in your backyard that has poor soil conditions, that doesn't drain well, that is pretty heavy clay, this group is not going to be the right choice for that area. They really have physical soil needs that allows for their roots to grow and penetrate and develop a good rhizome. They also need very good fertile soils, which we'll talk about a lot tonight today. If you're thinking that this might fit in well with a raised bed, perhaps it could. You might find that you have, say, a 6-inch raised bed or even much deeper than that. And this group might work okay with it if those roots are allowed to penetrate into the soil. But if you had a very shallow depth of a raised bed, say 6 inches or less, this is not going to be a group that works well. If you had a container, in most cases, we would not recommend rhubarb or asparagus to grow in a container based on the root system and just based on kind of the overall growth that that plant exhibits. Horseradish, you actually might be able to get away with growing in the container, and we'll discuss more tonight kind of why you might be able to do that. But I would say in most cases for this group, I would lean heavier on trying to grow in the actual soil if you can. If you're new to perennials, if you've never grown them before or had much experience with them, consider first thinking about an area in your growing area that is strictly for perennials. Perhaps you have a big plot where you grow your vegetables, your summer and your cool season vegetables every year. Consider putting your perennials on the edge of that growing area. So this would be vegetables that would not be in that yearly crop rotation. They would be able to kind of stand on their own at one part of your garden. It's very crucial, especially for some of these, to even consider what that footprint is of them. Rhubarb, like you see here, the spacing is sometimes 4 feet between rhubarb plants, and yet they will sometimes be as wide as they are tall. So they can take up a very large part of the garden with this. But recognize too that they will have some other needs that need to be addressed too, such as their depth of rooting systems. I think it's important here to recognize the establishment years and give a greater understanding of that lifespan. So it is that if this is something that you're really considering, recognize that it's going to be year 3 or 4 where the harvest is just great and the harvest is potentially overwhelming. And this could be something that you're dealing with for the next 10 to 15 years too, or if not longer, depending on that variety you're growing. Because they're going to be permanent, and permanent in quotes here, and they're going to stay around for quite some time, we would recommend you get a soil test. The soil test is really going to help you to figure out if you truly have some really good fertile soil, if the soil pH is where it needs to be, or if there's just other nutrient issues that you need to address before planting. And one of the main pieces of the soil test would be giving that soil pH. You'll find that it's very hard to change the soil pH once these plants have already been established. It's very complicated to do. You will find it will also limit growth if the soil pH isn't where it needs to be. So with that, address your soil needs. Maybe you need to modify the soil pH. Maybe you need to add additional nutrients. If you have an area where the soil is just a little bit poor, you need to come in with compost, aged manure, with lots of good ingredients to enrich that soil so that the plants are ready to grow and ready to thrive in that area. So on to our first big one for the night. This is our rhubarb. So this is the one that just thrives in the Midwest climate. And it is one that, the reason for it thriving and doing so well is that it needs about 500 hours between a temperature range of 28 to 49 degrees Fahrenheit for new bud growth to occur. This is really why you do not see rhubarb in very warm parts of the United States. I grew up in East Tennessee, and we don't grow rhubarb in East Tennessee because it stays too warm. It doesn't have that enough hours built in for the new bud growth to occur. You see in some parts of the United States where it is warmer that they're actually treating rhubarb as an annual. And I'm not particularly sure which variety that is, but certainly that is kind of the direction that they're going with rhubarb, is annual production, just based on the few buds that are growing from it. It is, of course, one of the first spring vegetables, so it is the one that's going to be slowly emerging from the soil, starting typically towards the end of March up here in Northern Illinois. You'll start to see potentially a lot of growth as the soil begins to warm up in April. One of the challenges with this plant is that it's a heavy nutrient feeder. And it is one where if you have encountered poor growth in some years from the rhubarb, it could be that it's time to address it. Could be this time to divide the plant, if you will, or you need to get into a routine of adding fertilizer, kind of circling around that rhubarb plant itself. Most are going to live about 10 plus years. I would say a lot of these might be hitting close to 20 years. So it could stay quite a bit in the growing area. And they're just massive plants. I think that is one of the trademarks of this, is that they can be very vigorous growers, and they can tend to kind of take over the garden in some years, which is why we state, its spacing should be 4.5 to 5 feet between rhubarb plants, because we expect it to get as tall as that too. Occasionally get questions about how much rhubarb does my family need? I say you're fine with probably one plant. I think that you're going to find that it's going to be a vigorous grower for you, that you just don't need to plant an additional one. I think one is going to be perfectly fine for a family of 4 or for a family of 10. I think that's what we've really noticed with our rhubarb at the extension office in Winnebago County. It yields, and we're just harvesting and harvesting and harvesting off of probably a 10-year-old plant at this point. And you see in the photos, the petioles and the stalks are the ones that are eaten. So when you're harvesting these petioles, extensions from the plant, these are the ones that you're harvesting and you're cutting up and using for crisps and for other recipes. The leaves are removed, and the leaves are not eaten because they contain oxalic acid. And there's some concern that it could actually, when the oxalic acid of the rhubarb leaves is eaten, it can isolate into your liver. It takes quite a lot, but still you're not eating the leaves because of this oxalic acid. This one is going to develop this extensive rhizome underground over time. And usually you're going to find that it can really spread out, and you'll find little bud growths from the side. In fact, most of the buds that develop from an established rhubarb plant tend to be on the outsides of the rhubarb crown. So it actually isn't really in the center anymore. It starts to kind of spread out. The stalks photos you see here, the petioles here, this looks very small. I think that a lot of us have experienced much wider rhubarb in our time. As far as its soil needs, one of the things that is kind of nice about this is that it's not too finicky when it comes to its soil needs. I mean, there's certainly things that it needs. It needs to have good, fertile, deep soil. So it needs to have, areas that have good compost that are added regularly, aged manure that's added. You have maybe you're adding some of the compost you're even making. So you're adding it to this area for the rhubarb. And one of the other things that's very nice, that's a wide pH tolerance. So if you had a growing area where the pH you felt was extremely acidic, maybe down into the 5s, or even neutral into the 7s, rhubarb is pretty tolerant of that. We don't really see that you need to change the soil pH if you really know what that one is. But certainly rhubarb needs full sun. It can get away with maybe 8 hours a day, maybe, but full sun is really what this plant is after. And the same is going to be for asparagus. And that certainly can really challenge you when it comes to where you might be planting these perennial plants, based on that both rhubarb and asparagus, along with some others we'll talk about tonight, need full sun. In thinking about the different cultivars that you might decide to plant or put out in the next couple of weeks, the main difference of these is mostly the stalk color, the petioles. They're going to be either red or they're going to be green. And then from there will be a couple of minor differences. You're going to find potentially different cultivars locally. The one that I found today at my local nursery is Canada Red. It's pretty similar to most of the other ones that you see here, such as Cherry Red or Crimson Red. McDonald is one we also recommend, Ruby and Valentine. Those are all very traditional red cultivar of rhubarb, and meaning that the petioles are red. Some of them may also have streaks of pink, which is a very nice kind of growth feature. One of the green ones that we recommend is Victoria. There's a number of other green ones out there as well. And the green ones are just a different color. You're not necessarily going to find too much difference in flavor. So when you look at these different cultivars, the main difference is going to be the stalk size. Sometimes the petioles and the stalks can be a little bit bigger in width for some of them, although you may not see much difference. Occasionally, some of them will also be not as sour, such as Canada Red. Canada Red is actually higher in sugars. So if you're trying to limit some of the sourness of the rhubarb, that certainly is a variety that you might find that might work for you. Even sometimes the rhubarb stalks can have not as much fiber, so they might not be as fibrousness as some of the others out there. Also the color when cooked. So if you're thinking, okay, I want rhubarb, I'd love the green. Unfortunately, when you cook green rhubarb, it tends to develop a grayish kind of color. Not all of them do that, but certainly a lot really do. And that might be something to avoid if you're thinking of showcasing a very nice dish and it's gray. It's the gray rhubarb color. McDonald is one that does tolerate clay soils, so seek that one out if you find that you're in an area that's heavy clay soils. It's one that is pretty good for that one. Ruby is one that has been recommended that just retains its color really well when it's cooked. And then Victoria is our green rhubarb, and it is one that produces a lot of seed stalks. It's great otherwise, just note that it will produce some seed stalks, and we'll talk more about seed stalks tonight. If you're thinking about getting new plants this season, there's different ways. You could, of course, order seeds and start your seeds indoors, but we really don't recommend doing that. It's more troublesome than what it should be. And when I kind of did a search online to find rhubarb seeds, there's not as many folks out there, companies out there selling it. So we wouldn't recommend starting rhubarb seeds indoors. We would recommend, say, a 1-year crown, which is what you see here. This crown, this plant, already has 1 year of growth. And so when you plant it in the soil in 2021, it means that you're getting closer to that full rhubarb harvest. You might also find cuttings. So these cuttings will sometimes be found at home and garden centers. Typically, we sometimes will see them in kind of a box, if you will, with some of the other perennial plants. And they tend to be, they're usually not a year old, or they're kind of in that gray area of that I would still probably treat them as this is their first year of growth. You also, of course, have divisions. This is where you know someone that has rhubarb and they early in the season have already started to divide their rhubarb up. And that would be a great opportunity to acquire rhubarb pretty quickly. It's probably a little bit too late to actually get a division of rhubarb at this point from a neighbor or a friend, just based on how quickly the rhubarb is growing right now. But certainly next year in, say, middle March, end of March, you might be able to acquire a division of rhubarb from a friend. So certainly right now, closer to maturity is going to be your crowns. We're going to find these at home and garden centers really regularly, which is what you see here. They're a year ahead for you, and it's getting closer to the harvest. And the seeds would be the ones that we would not recommend. It's just harder to establish, and you also have an additional year of growth that you're going to encounter. For the seasonal management of this one, we would recommend some sort of addition of manure or compost yearly in the fall. That would be something that would be very beneficial for this group, for rhubarb. And you may decide to kind of place this around kind of the top of the plant, just knowing full well that after that first kind of hard frost in the fall, most of these stalks are going to start to wilt. They're going to start to break down and fall on top of the plant. And this might be a good time to come in there and put some manure or compost. You might even consider doing some compost early in the spring season too. If you are planting for the first time this year, you would certainly want to place some compost into that whole area that you're digging for your rhubarb, getting that in there to kind of break things up and get that root system really thriving and growing. This is one that has commonly seen a recommendation of a fertilizer. And that might be something that you revisit this year, is a seasonally approach of a balanced fertilizer of 10-10-10 of nitrogen, 10 parts nitrogen, 10 parts phosphorus, 10 parts potassium, so that the plant, if you haven't done it for a couple of years, the plant is getting some of that fertility. As much as you probably are encountered a lot of vigorous growth because we have great fertile soils in most of Illinois, this still might be an area that you might consider adding some fertilizers. Rhubarb is notorious for sending seed stalks up throughout the harvest period. And when these seed stalks show up, which you see here in this photo, you need to remove them. What's occurring at that place is that the energy is moving away from the rhizome, and it's focusing on seed stalks instead of focusing on development of the rest of the plant. So remove these throughout the season, because it's very important to center that energy back to the rhizome for bud development and stalk growth, petiole growth rather. If this happens after harvest period and it's gotten away from you, you might be okay just kind of letting it go to seed, but certainly recognize that those first couple of years of establishment, if this is happening, you want to ensure that you're removing this seed stalk, because it is sending energy away from a 2 or 3 year old rhubarb plant that really needs that energy to devote it to the rhizome. If it's a mature rhubarb, if it is, say, a 10, 15-year-old rhubarb plant, they are notorious for sending out a lot of seed stalks throughout the season. And still, I would encourage you to remove them as soon as you see them. If you consider dividing, this is going to be an early spring action, and it would be something that would address the vigor of your plant. If you felt like it was just kind of overwhelmed with too many petioles, too much growth, this would be what you would do early in the season. So yet again, probably mid-March, end of March is when you might look at this, just as you're starting to see some growth, some initial growth. So as far as that first dividing, I would look around age 5. That would be kind of when I would start to consider dividing that rhubarb plant. It may not need it. It certainly is a plant that may not need it. But if you found that the petioles were kind of all over the place, if you found that they were not producing as vigorous or in the width that you're really after, and if you felt like they were crowding each other up, this would be a time to really consider that dividing. And it may be that this season, 2021, is when you realize that you need to divide your rhubarb up for 2022. Sometimes it takes a season to realize that, oh, this plant needs to be divided, or this plant is okay for a period of time. But it's going to encourage better growth. It's just going to allow for this plant to really thrive for you. And most of the new growth is on the edge of the crown. So that's kind of what you're after, is to try to get some of those new buds that are just starting to break and to kind of open up mid-March, end of March. And you kind of want to take the plant and kind of look above it, kind of look down at it, and try to kind of divide it up into different quarters. Typically, as you look at that crown and kind of think about a circle, consider kind of divide up into 4 quadrants with it. And then transplant soon after. So move it to another part of your area, share it with a friend or a neighbor, and then you would harvest next year from it. So you would treat this dividing as that it's going to now go into another year. So it's kind of treating it almost as a 1-year-old crown, if you will. So you can see kind of with our rhubarb at the Rockford office, this was just divided this past season with some great Master Gardener volunteers that divided it. One of them had previously been divided a couple years prior by myself. I'll tell you, it's hard. It's not as easy as it looks to divide it, especially when there's no growth. So certainly the reason that we were dividing it was because it's just very overwhelming. And when you actually got into the center of the rhubarb plant, you started to see that the petioles were all over the place. They're small, they're puny, they're crowding out each other, and it needed to be divided. So both of them have been divided in the last couple of years and are producing much better. And yet again, this is going to be happening middle of March, end of March is when you might look at this, just as the soil is starting to warm up, just as some of the snow hopefully has melted, is when you would do this division before you have this growth occurring. So you can kind of see here on the left, what I mean is that, I'm kind of coming in here and I am kind of looking at it in a bit of a quadrant system where I can now have 1, 2, 3, 4 kind of cuts I would make. One, of course, is going to stay. It would kind of be the other 3 that would be removed. And you may find you don't need to do 4. You may find you could just split it right down the middle and take the other part to another part of your garden or share with someone nearby. But you'll just kind of see a little bit of that growth early in the spring is really what you're after. And that can allow for you to kind of to do this division and hopefully kind of reinvigorate that plant for the season. And now you have an additional growth. So when it comes to though, should I harvest from it after it has been divided and a transplant has been left? I'd kind of put that back to you and kind of what you'd like to do. I would say, depending on how much is taken and how much is left behind, you might actually decide to give this season a break. But I will also share that we have found that with some of our dividing of that season, it's as if we did not divide the plant. It's as if it still produced extremely well that season. And we had a shorter season of harvest, but we still took some of it. You can see what the division looks like. This was one that was recently done this past spring in the Rockford, Winnebago office. So after it had been divided, it had been planted, you can see it's starting to kind of really jump up. And this plant looks very similar to a one-year-old crown. I would get at a nursery even. So it looks kind of no different than some of what you would find at the nurseries this time of year. So for this harvest, then, if it's a new plant in 2021, there's no harvest. You're going to plant it, you're going to let it start really developing some good rhizome underneath that soil, really develop a lot of good growth this season. And then from there into the next year is when you may do a smaller harvest. If you planted rhubarb in 2021, you're looking at about a 1 to 2 week harvest in 2021. So this year, you could probably get away with a 1 to 2 week harvest, but don't really push it this year. If you planted a new rhubarb plant in 2019, or it's older than 3 years at this point, you're looking at about an 8 to 10 week harvest. You might be a little cautious and maybe say about maybe 5 to 6 weeks, but ideally you could probably go ahead with 8 to 10 week harvest for a 3-year-old plant. There is a time where you could take too much, and it's really important to leave a third. And that may be what helps you determine if you are about to harvest too much, if you're not getting that kind of third of petioles left behind that need to be left behind. In most cases, the best way to harvest rhubarb is kind of a pull and twist of these petioles. So you're kind of pulling them and kind of twisting them at the same time. You also want to consider removing the leaves at that time, cutting off the end of it. The leaf portion tends to cause the rhubarb petioles to wilt soon after harvest. So you're much better off pulling, twisting them, and removing the leaves at that time. That's just increasing wilt. And in most cases, we're looking at concluding it's around the end of June. Does depend on the season. Yet again, it's back to the age of that rhubarb, and it's back to kind of when your harvest period began as well. One of the main questions we got this week, which was to be expected, was freeze damage on rhubarb. This is a very common thing that occurs in Northern Illinois and certainly other parts of the state where you may have rhubarb that has been growing and you now have freeze damage to it. In most cases, you'll see kind of the petioles will be limp, the leaves will be wilted even, and even if you ate it, the flavor would be muted. The University of Illinois Extension's policy and kind of stance on this is that you should not be eating any of the rhubarb petioles that have been freeze damaged. So if you notice that they're limp, that they're wilted, anything like that, we would not recommend you eating from it. There is concern that oxalic acid from the leaves is actually moving to the stalks during this freeze that you might have encountered and causing certainly a concentration of it that we do not want you to consume. Furthermore, as much as we had some freeze damage last night or potentially some freeze damage, you might give it a day or two to see what the damage actually looks like. You may not actually see the freeze damage symptoms for a day or two. So it may take some time for this. The new growth should be fine. So if, we've got these little buds, as you kind of see here in the soil that have kind of yet to open up, those should be fine. It's those where we kind of see a full petiole and a full leaf of the rhubarb where there's freeze damage that we're really concerned with. And we recommend to remove them, compost them, not consume them. If it is one of those things where you're just not sure, gosh, just, in doubt, just throw it out. Just don't worry about it. It's going to get new growth. We know it's going to get new growth as the season goes along. But yes, that would be something to kind of look at this last couple of days. So on to our other one, asparagus. So this is one that, like my rhubarb, produces very early in the spring. And it's going to produce spears, which are basically stems and extensions from this underground rhizome of a plant. You can see from this photo here, Nathan has provided, certainly some will be very small and kind of skinny in width, but sometimes you have some very big asparagus spears. Later in the season, one of the things that develops is the actual fern, which is typically kind of a leaf extension of these spears. You will also find older plantings that include female plants, but it's very common now that most of the plants that we grow are male plants. So you will have either male or female plants. And we'll talk a little bit more about why you might go towards one or the other. Keep in mind that this one takes 5 years to maturity, and you will do some harvest and are able to do some harvest, but 5 years to maturity is really what we're looking at. And honestly, it's living beyond 15 years. It's still, yet again, very common for asparagus patches over many parts of our counties that are 30, 35 years old. Very, very vigorous, very, very yielding still. In most of the cases with those, they're probably a mixture of male and female plants that are allowing for them to spread really quickly. So the asparagus soil it needs fertile, well-drained soil. That's very similar to what you saw with rhubarb, is that very similar growing situations. We would also recommend they are planted in the northern of the garden. And this is due to the fern that they're going to develop that could potentially kind of overshadow other parts of your growing area. They also need a little bit of a depth to them. You might consider about 8 inches is really the starting depth of this group. So if you had a raised bed, or if you had another area where it was compacted at a lower depth, this may not be the one that you want to actually grow, because it's going to go deep. It's going to go 6 feet deep. It also has a pH of a 6.5 to 7.0, and it cannot tolerate acidic soils. And that might be something to consider, is that if you're thinking of growing both asparagus and rhubarb kind of in the same area, you might ensure that that pH is 6.5 to 7 in order to address the asparagus needs, but also that rhubarb would be able to tolerate that 6.5 to 7. You'll see in this photo here, this is actually a green variety of asparagus, and yet it still has a bit of a purple hue to it. So you will sometimes find that some of your traditional green hybrid varieties will still have a bit of a purple tint to them. Asparagus are either bought as crowns or as seeds. Like with rhubarb, I would not recommend asparagus seeds. They're very less common. It takes a while for them to get started, sometimes 10 to 12 weeks of starting them indoors under grow lights. And like with others, it's going to delay your harvest by a year. You're going to be much better off purchasing your asparagus crowns. These are most commonly grown. Yet again, you've got a good year old when to purchase it, and they're going to do really well when soil temperatures are in the 50s. So as much as what we kind of see in northern Illinois with our soil temperatures, you might look towards kind of planting them the first week of April. I don't know if the soil temperatures are going to be warm enough for asparagus to be transplanted, say, end of March. It's probably going to be a little bit too cold for them. One thing that I did not mention, when we think about asparagus, rhubarb, we would say one rhubarb plant is probably going to feed the entire family. It might feed the entire block of the neighborhood when you live. For asparagus, though, we would typically recommend about 10 kind of crowns, 10 plants per person for a family. That may seem pretty excessive, and yet they're not going to be as vigorous of yields compared to what your rhubarb plant is going to be. And yet again, if it's just you eating the asparagus, maybe you don't need that much either, perhaps. For the varieties then, the most common is going to be your green. This is typically what we find most at home and garden centers and other locations. You're still going to find a little bit of the purple color to it. You might be thinking to yourself, what could I get white asparagus? What are the white asparagus varieties? And these, in fact, are green asparagus that are being grown in a way that blocks out the sunlight. So as the green asparagus is starting to emerge, a grower is coming in and covering it with a bucket or covering it with soil to limit that light and keep it that kind of white coloration. So that's where you're getting the white asparagus from. That's also why it's typically more expensive. The purple type is a very variety specific with this beautiful purple color. They tend to have a bit of a higher sugar content, but they lose the color when it's cooked. So just like the green rhubarb will transform to a gray color, my purple asparagus, when it is cooked, will lose that purple color and go back to a green color. In thinking about these varieties, you've got two groups. You've got kind of this open pollinated, which can traditionally include sometimes a plant that is male or a plant that is female. And then you have there are a lot of older varieties, and they tend to have lower yields with them. They have certainly gotten very used to our growing area and the climate in North Illinois, but they have lower yields compared to some of the newer varieties available to you. They also tend to produce seed, especially if it's a female. It's going to devote a lot of energy to producing seed and developing in that fern, which we'll talk about tonight some more. You've also got the hybrids. These are all males. They have a longer lifespan. They are not going to produce seed. They are still going to develop a fern, and they're still going to develop spears for you. And they typically develop more spears, in fact, sometimes 2 to 3 times as many asparagus spears as compared to some of the other open pollinated or even a female variety of asparagus. They just are focused more on spears and not focused on developing that seed. So some different series out there is the Washington series. We see this one still pretty regularly, Mary Washington, Martha Washington. They can grow exceptionally well. They just have lower yields compared to others. They're going to be devoting on seed development compared to the spear development. There's a purple group, a purple passion, Pacific purple. These are purple. These are also open pollinated, so kind of keep that in mind that the yields may not be where you'd like them to be. And then we also have the Guelph series. This is bred out of Canada. This is Millennium Eclipse. Millennium is one that continues to be highly endorsed as a great asparagus variety in Illinois. These are very vigorous. They're also very high yielding. I bring up the Jersey series because this was one that we have traditionally in a lot of our extension bulletins and extension websites endorsed, is this Jersey series of Jersey Giant, Jersey Jewel, Jersey Prince, Jersey King. These are actually on their way of being discontinued. So you may not find them anymore after this year or into the next couple of years. I know that they have stopped selling these to asparagus growers. They have kind of stopped this line. However, I was at a home and garden center today and I found Jersey King. So you still may find it available to you, but just know that these are slowly being on their way out and being discontinued. There's other ones, there's Sequoia, Porthos, Welker Deluxe. Those are all furthermore recommended varieties too. As far as your planting, consider about 12 inches wide and 8 inches deep. That's really the minimum that you're starting off with for this asparagus. And furthermore, consider 40 to 48 inches between a row. That's really what you're after. You might even push that to about 5 feet just to give this plant some more space is truly what would be beneficial. Like with our rhubarb, we want to think about compost, aged manure before planting, any of those good ingredients that could really help this plant really take off and really thrive. One of the other things that's recommended is to consider an 8-inch trench. So kind of going down your asparagus row and creating an 8-inch trench and then placing the crowns based on this 12 inches wide spacing and covering just 4 inches. And then as it gets growing, as it gets a little more growth to it, later in the season, this might be end of June, you come through and you add 2 more inches, and then finally you do maybe another final 2 inches. Just allows for kind of a slow growth for this plant as it really takes off. You'll note in this photo from Nathan how much asparagus he has actually planted in his rows. So you can kind of see this 12 inches down a row is really what you're after here. And you may find you want to plant much more asparagus, certainly, than how much rhubarb you might be planting. So for weed management in asparagus, they're very poor competitors against weeds, especially those first couple of years. One thing that has always shown up is that folks will salt their asparagus fields. And no, you should not salt the asparagus fields. This actually creates more problems than good, and it was sometimes mentioned and recommended previously, in previous decades, to address weed control, and yet it causes a lot more harm for the plants themselves. It tends to also make it a little bit harder for them to absorb water. It certainly is going to affect those good soil microbes that we're always after, trying to really encourage good growth from those microbes to do their job. So we do not encourage any sort of salting to address the weeds. Keep the salt in the kitchen, not in the field, if you will. Look to having this weed-free at planting. Also, if you're thinking that this is going to go in an area that's very weedy, this is not the plant for you. You know, avoid planting asparagus in a very weedy area, because that's truly what you're going to encounter. It's going to be a poor competitor. Every season, look to do some light cultivation. You could also put some straw mulch around the asparagus to kind of help with weed control and keeping things in place. You may also find some herbicides available, some of which could be utilized before the asparagus emerges in the spring, as well as after emergence too. Yet again, just look on the back of these herbicides to see if they are recommended for asparagus. There is an insect pest for asparagus, and this is one that has been observed in some asparagus patches in parts of Illinois. One of the things that you see here with this asparagus beetle, it overwinters as the adult, and then it tends to emerge in the spring to start eating and lay eggs on spears. So it's kind of getting a 1-2 punch. Furthermore, the larvae that hatch will also target the asparagus spears too and chew on them. There are certain strategies you could do. You can remove and destroy any of the ferns that develop on your asparagus in late winter, when we'll talk more about the fern. You also want to harvest clean. And what we mean here is that if you have decided that this week and this day is your asparagus harvest, you would go down your asparagus row and you would remove everything. Yes, there might be some spears that are really bad and you're not going to eat, but you're going to remove them and not leave them behind so that this asparagus beetle is unable to target them and build up its population. I think one of the other benefits here with insect scouting for asparagus beetle is that the color is going to stand out to you. You're going to be able to really see the asparagus beetle much more so than some of those other insect pests that sometimes target, say, like tomatoes, such as tobacco or tomato hornworm, that looks the same color as the tomato plant. Row cover might be possible, and I haven't looked too much into it, but certainly having a row cover that allows for light penetration and creates a barrier might work, but it may not work fully due to how this beetle overwinters and moves. Here you see 2 photos provided by Nathan, and you can see kind of what this asparagus beetle really looks like, and certainly a lot of the damage that it's causing on the spear, this kind of chewing mouth parts that it's really targeting. Further, you actually see what the eggs look like. These little tiny gray eggs that have been laid by the asparagus beetle. These are going to hatch. They are then going to target the rest of the spear. So there's not too much that you can sometimes do to address it, other than trying to really harvest and pick really often, I think is what you're really after here. So your harvest then. Most of the time we would recommend doing a snap. So when you feel that the spear is about 7 to 9 inches, you want to kind of bend it back to one direction, and then it should just kind of snap off. And within this action, this snapping action, it will actually mean that you're not going to have to cut off the ends of the asparagus when you're doing the cooking. The reason that we tend to cut off the ends of the asparagus is that they tend to be a little bit woodier and more fiber to them compared to when they're actually snapped in the field. And it's a little bit of a quicker harvest because of this too. We're just kind of going through and snapping them. You might be able to cut them with a knife, kind of being very careful with this knife cutting because you actually want to not do any harm to this asparagus rhizome. I think one of the challenges with this kind of cutting of the knife, though, is that you still may have to cut off the tips, or rather the ends of these asparagus, because the snapping action would have actually removed the woody part. But by actually using a knife to kind of cut the asparagus, you still potentially have some of those woody parts to it. You're looking for about a 7 to 9 inch asparagus, and the tip should be a little bit slightly tight within it. When it comes to the tenderness of asparagus spears, the actual width doesn't matter too much. A bigger width is not going to denote that it's actually woody or woodier than a smaller width one. So kind of keep that in mind when you have some of these. And you can certainly see that this is a pretty wide asparagus tip and would still be fine. It wouldn't be woody. They also have a short shelf life. You kind of notice that at grocery stores where all their asparagus is put into bins of water. And the same will be true for your asparagus at home, is that as soon as it's harvested, try to put these spears at the end of the spears into some water. So the harvest window then. So let's say that you have planted in 2021 a new asparagus crown. The next year in 2022, you're looking at about 1 to 2 week harvest. In year 3, you're looking at a 3-week harvest. Year 4, 6-week harvest. 5th year, about 8-week harvest. So at year 5, you've reached full maturity, but between year 2 and year 5, you still have opportunities to harvest asparagus with it. You want to aim to end your harvest about mid-June. That's really what you're after here. And the other thing to consider is that one kind of thing you'll note is that the asparagus spears are going to need to be stopped when they get about 3/4 of an inch, or let me step back, 3/4 of all spears that have emerged that you're thinking about harvesting from. If they are less than a pencil width, you're not going to do any harvest. You actually don't want to, you want to step back. But certainly you could factor in kind of the weeks of harvest with this as well. You see here photos of Nathan's that he's provided where he has the purple coloration. He also has the green varieties in here as well. So kind of a good mixture of it. And that would be fine for you to do too. Look to have some of those varieties that are purple and some that are green, and that can really be a nice a quality that you have with them too. So the fern is going to develop, and the reason for this fern is that it is going to allow for growth to be centered back to the plant. So you actually need this fern to develop. Unlike the rhubarb, where we suggest removing the actual seed as it develops, this is something that we're actually going to encourage you to keep. You want to have this in place. It's going to get about 4 to 6 weeks, 6 feet tall. It's going to be needed for next year's growth as well. So you really want this fern to develop and kept in place. And typically we're going to recommend keeping it in place from fall into early winter, and then you could probably remove it. Some folks will actually remove it after the first hard frost. Others will remove it in early spring. I think both of those could be a challenge, could be an opportunity. It's kind of up to you what you decide to do because of that. So our final big 3 is horseradish. This is one where it's grown as both a perennial or an annual. It really is up to you what you decide to do with it, but certainly could become a great perennial plant in your growing area. In Illinois, we produce the most horseradish in a part of Illinois, in southern Illinois, called American Bottoms. It's grown as an annual in that direction, but you could certainly grow it as a perennial. And sometimes maybe you unfortunately are growing it as a perennial, as you may have left behind a horseradish that has continued to grow and now become perennial. Needs are very similar to rhubarb and asparagus. When you think about its soil needs and what it's after, you want a good soil depth, like asparagus. You also want a sunny location, and you want to consider working in lots of aged manure and compost. This is one that can also spread really quickly, and you may find that it may be much beneficial to do it in some sort of raised bed or in some sort of container, because it can be notorious for spreading pretty quickly in your area. As much as it's given a perennial kind of view, it is harvested in a way that's a little bit like an annual. It's kind of an unusual plant in that capacity. And you see the plant here itself, with kind of wide, big leaves. When you're thinking of adding this to your growing area, you could do a couple ways. You could do root cuttings, or what will sometimes be called a set, or you could be getting whole plants. And that's what you see here in this photo, is these kind of whole plants that already have a lot of leaf growth to them and could be planted in your garden. For some of these kind of roots that haven't yet to really develop any sort of upper growth, you're going to have a delayed emergence. And it typically can sometimes be recommended to give it at least a year to develop a bit of a root system here. Space the plants at about 1 foot apart if you have them as plants. And if it's roots, if you're growing from roots that have yet to develop any sort of leaf material, you actually want to get them right under that soil line at about 45 degrees. And then you want to cover them additionally with about 2 to 3 inches of soil to allow for the roots to really develop. In most cases for this one, such as the harvest, we're looking at about the first fall frost. And you could probably go a little bit deeper than that, probably give it a couple of weeks from it, but certainly this is one that is going to be a first fall frost compared to my rhubarb and asparagus that is going to be harvested in the springtime. The odd piece about horseradish is that in most cases, when we recommend harvest from it, we would suggest removing the whole plant. So kind of pulling the whole plant out of the ground, kind of dividing up these roots and harvest from the main roots, and then leaving behind smaller ones, pencil width. So putting those back into the ground for next year. So this is where it gets into that you could do as perennial, or you actually could do it as an annual, because this action of removing the whole plant to harvest from is then up to you whether you want to keep it as perennial or keep it as annual. But that tends to be the easiest way to do sort of harvest. You might be able to remove some of them by hand and keeping the plant in place in that growing area, but you would also be certainly fine to kind of bring it all out and kind of lay it out and divide them from there. The better flavor tends to be at year 1 roots. So if you have, say, gotten a plant from the Home and Garden Center that already has growth to it, this, of course, will be one that is at year 1 and would be fine to harvest from. If it's from like a cutting or one of the sets, you might consider waiting a year for harvest from them. And in fact, they may just be pretty small and puny and really need another year of growth in that area. So I want to highlight a couple here at the end that you might have some potential to consider adding and experimenting to see if they could stay perennial for you. This is globe artichoke. I grew globe artichoke last year. You don't really find it locally, and yet I tried it as a seeds indoors. So I started my seeds probably mid-February and then planted about middle of May. It has potential as a container plant. It's more regularly grown as an annual, but there's other parts of the United States where they have tried to grow it as a perennial, and it does grow as perennial. For us in our area, my idea was to maybe see if I could overwinter it successfully. It is one that you have to trick it. So you have to, at a certain stage, you need to get it out. You need to get it out early so that the cold spring weather can kind of trigger it to develop better growth. It's kind of a weird system. You have to do this trickery, if you will, which means that you tend to need to plant it earlier than you might traditionally plant it in other parts because it needs a bit of that coldness. There's a couple cultivars, Green Globe, Imperial Star. Those are ones that have been recommended for perennial types. Spacing is about 4 feet and needs full sun. And then you harvest your artichokes at about 3 inches diameter. So in the first year of growth, this is what you see here, very, very small artichokes that were developed from it. And certainly knowing full well that we're in Northern Illinois, I recognized that I had to address how I was going to overwinter it, and that it certainly was going to be an experiment. So you see kind of the stages, if you will, of, growth is just about 3 inches when these were planted from seeds indoors. Later in the season, it certainly got to about 3 to 4 feet. And then I experimented with overwintering in different setups. So for one, you see one of them was just covered with a planter that contained leaves as well as a mixture of compost. The black landscape fabric, underneath it are 2 artichokes, and they are surrounded by a mixture of compost, leaves, and other things. You'll also note that this is a raised bed too. So my idea was to try it, to grow it in raised beds to see how well it will do. Yet to see much growth is what I will say. I'm still experimenting with it to see if some of the warming soil temperatures that we expect in the next couple of weeks will kind of re-energize and regrow this plant so it can become perennial. But certainly had lots of great growth as an annual, not as much artichokes, and yet I'm kind of at a place where I'm not ready to necessarily recommend it as perennial for Illinois. Ask me again in a couple months, if you will. Jerusalem artichoke is another one that has potential to be a perennial. It is, yet again, kind of growing these underground, these artichokes. They have no botanical relationship with the globe artichoke. And it is one that folks are utilizing in baking as a potato substitute. The only thing I will recommend is, and mention, is that it does have a compound when it's cooked called inulin. And some folks are very sensitive to inulin when they are eating it. And so just kind of be mindful that that can sometimes cause some stomach cramps. The Jerusalem artichoke can. So that's kind of why we will say that it can work as a perennial, but it is one that you want to try, eat it before you actually grow it. It's in the sunflower family. You see the growth at the bottom that it produces, but certainly maybe better in a container because it can sometimes be a little invasive when it comes to where you're growing it. And our final one for the evening is ramps or wild leeks. And certainly there's a lot of places in Illinois where folks are harvesting ramps from wooded areas, hopefully on their property and other areas that they're familiar with. But these are ones that you could grow as a perennial. The seeds can be purchased. They're very slow to germinate. So it usually takes about a year for them just to get some growth and germination. And realistically, it's about 5 years before harvest of these ramps for growing it. Their growing needs, medium wet soils, very full to partial shade, kind of woodland type conditions is what they need. And furthermore, you could eat them as edible leaf or even the bulb. But it's worth maybe trying out if you've got a wooded area. Certainly recognize that it's going to be quite some time before you even begin the harvest of them, and certainly some time before they even begin to germinate. As we think about this group tonight, then, if you've encountered problems previously with these plants, consider, if it has poor vigor, if it has discoloration, it could be soil related. It could be that you need to come in and add some compost, add some aged manure, kind of fully address some of those soil needs that the plant really needs. You might also consider it's time to fertilize. It could be that the reason that the plant isn't doing good or not really producing well for you is that it's time to fertilize. If none of these things are necessarily addressing the plant, it might be time to get a soil test just to see if there's something going on that you're unaware of. If the soil pH is not where it needs to be, that will in turn sometimes show up as poor vigor and poor growth. And you can add as much fertilizer as you want, but if the soil pH isn't where it needs to be, it's not going to matter. The plant's not going to be able to get that fertilizer. Some of these other issues that could be addressed with things like compost and manure and other good benefits to your soil could help for poor drainage, even building up the soil with a limited soil depth, something like acidic soils too. I would say that it's going to be very hard for you to address sunlight if the plant is not getting enough sunlight. It's going to be very hard to do that and keep that in place unless you move the plant. Diseases and insects, they happen. They can still happen. You can have root issues, you can have crown rot, you can have additional insects that go for your plants. So certainly those are things to be on the lookout for in some years. So we're starting to get wrapped up tonight. I know you've got some questions in the chat box, which is really great to see, and continue to add those as well. I'll send you resources tomorrow that go to each of these. I'll mention Nathan has a great bit of an overview on asparagus marketing and production. He gets into a lot of the varieties that he's grown and some of the things that he's seen. There's also some really good guides from Horseradish in the Home Garden from the University of Minnesota. There's also a paper out there that basically gives you the history of horseradish production in Illinois and what horseradish production in Illinois currently looks like. If like me, you kind of get a little bit nerdy when it comes to understanding how things grow and where they grow, and this is a really interesting paper that I'll share with you if you're just bored and have nothing else to do, perhaps. And finally, a really good rhubarb handout from Iowa State will also be shared with you tomorrow. I'll mention again, we've got more webinars coming up. Next week is going to be raspberry and blackberry production in the backyard. This will be followed by raised bed and container vegetable gardening, and then finally weed management in the vegetable gardening. If you register for the whole series, you will get an email, of course, from me every week with a new login. But certainly we still have room and would love for you all to join us at these additional sessions if you'd like. You can see our website here, and I'll make sure with the email you tomorrow has a link where you could directly register for that. I also want to mention there's another horticulture webinar series going on with Bruce Black, a horticulture educator, and Carol Lee Whiteside. His begin next week, and you can see his are at 5:30 p.m. and they cover topics such as kitchen propagation, growing and preserving herbs. He is covering strawberries on May 12th and also creating bottle terrariums. Yet again, I'll send you an email tomorrow that has a link to these webinars if you're interested in signing up for them. And you can hear from myself and Bruce for a couple of weeks there. So as we get wrapped up tonight, as you think about new plantings or planting these in the new growing area, is it possible to do a single bed for all, a single growing area for all? It could be. I think that it's very important to address kind of 4 things. Is the pH where it needs to be? Certainly true for asparagus, although rhubarb will tolerate quite a bit. Is the soil depth where it needs to be? Is it possible for those plants to send their roots down much deeper for it to? Look at that full sun. Make sure the plant's getting full sun. And then is it very good, fertile soil that is not risk of compaction? Those will kind of be the 4 that I might look at. And then from there, consider it has its spacing needs addressed. Make sure that it's spaced correctly, especially starting out. It's very hard to, move them around, if you will. So really consider choosing your site wisely based on the plant's short and long-term needs. And when we think about this, think about those first couple of years of the plant's life, where it has to send some good roots down. It doesn't need to sit in saturated water. It really wants to have good, warm, or fertile soil, while also recognizing what is year 15, year 20, gosh, year 24, and year 30 going to potentially look like for your asparagus beds. Recognize that it's permanent. And again, it's in quotes. You don't have to keep it permanent, but you need to recognize that this is a bit of a permanent situation here. Give your plants time to develop. Let them get the growth they need underground. you may not see a lot this first couple of years. And yet it's getting the growth it needs to really thrive and really grow those first couple of years. And get into this idea of not harvesting too much. Give some patience. Have some patience here these first couple of years for some of these new plants that you're going to be planting. And if they are, year 5, year 6 at this point that you have, or year 24, maybe it's time to divide. Maybe it's time to, see what you need to do to kind of reinvigorate them. So that's my email address. That's my phone number as well. I'm going to turn my video back on just kind of briefly. So I'll just kind of show you before I get to questions. So here's our kind of rhubarb crown. So you can kind of see that it's got a couple of growths already from it. And it has a little bit of this crown here, which you can kind of see that I would plant in the entire garden. So this entire pot would then go into the ground. And then I'm not going to harvest from it this year, but next year I can do a couple weeks of harvest from it. You compare the rhubarb to the horseradish. So the horseradish, which you actually saw is some photos of. What's interesting about this is that, well, this looks like one plant. It actually has about 3 different plants in it. So I would actually get about 3 different horseradish plants from this one container. And I would actually want to do that. I would want to kind of take it out and spread them out. Each of these would probably be planted about a foot between. And yet again, it'd kind of be up to me as far as how much and how I want to harvest it in the season, whether I keep it as a perennial or whether I keep it as an annual. In fact, I might even decide to break it up and keep one as a perennial and maybe the others actually treated as annuals. So you may see that. You may see that the rhubarb is just one singular crown, or you may actually find asparagus or even horseradish where you have multiple plants in a single container. You just want to kind of look in there and see what you have. So let me look at my questions then. I'm going to start all the way back. All right, so let's see. Yeah, a number of you have shared that you have very old rhubarb patches. Someone has 24-year-old rhubarb patch. Someone else has a 45-year-old rhubarb patch and just continues to produce magnificently. So really common to see a lot of these older ones is what we really note. Another 41-year-old rhubarb patch. That seems to be the trend tonight, is finding old rhubarbs. Chris asked, can you compost the rhubarb leaves? You can compost those leaves. So if you had a hard freeze and those leaves, have wilted, they would be fine to be composted into the soil. The oxalic acid is more a concern when you are actually consuming it. We don't see a concern with it breaking down into compost. I would still probably shred those leaves up a little bit more to help speed up that process of the rhubarb leaves breaking down. There's a question about how long to wait for full harvest from a division of rhubarb. When you divide that rhubarb, I would almost treat all of them as a year 1 crown again. And especially if you were taking some of them and putting into new locations, I would treat those as year 1. Now, from that main one, I think you want to see how things look that season, because you may find there's still a lot of petioles that develop, and you may be able to get away with not necessarily the full rhubarb harvest, but maybe half of that rhubarb harvest that season that you might traditionally have. So it could be that you're looking at maybe 4 weeks of harvest might be what I do. I think that's pretty important because you still want to ensure that the rhizomes that have been divided are from that original one are getting the energy back to them and allowing for them to really thrive too. Question, should the seed stalk also be pulled and twisted off? There's not been too much suggestion one way or the other about that seed stalk. Just getting it off of the plant, it sometimes might be easier just to come through and kind of clip it compared to the petioles that tend to be pretty easier to do that way. Question, what's a good source for soil testing? I'll send out some resources for soil testing in my email tomorrow. some of the places that we might recommend sending in a soil sample. Question, how can you tell the male from the female asparagus plants? So the male and female asparagus plants will develop different flowers. That will be something that you will notice. The females will also develop kind of red spears on the fern. So both of these are happening on the fern. Let me clarify. The flowers, either male or female, will develop on the fern itself, and they look different. The male flowers will have a bit of a pistil to them. The female flowers will develop that kind of red kind of seed that you note, that you will sometimes see. That's sometimes the main giveaway. What I should also mention is that, from a single, say, asparagus planting area, you're most likely just going to have either male or female. But certainly older plantings, 30 or so years, you may find there's a mixture in there too. But that would be the main difference, is the flowers will look different. The females will typically have a bit of some of those red kind of berries that develop from the fern. Question, why are the Jersey Giants being discontinued? I have a patch of this that is 5 years old. I'm not sure, Jen. It doesn't necessarily seem like it's an issue related to sales or related to popularity. I think that it is the company that has mostly grown these and sold to people has gotten out of the business. And with that, they've just decided to devote to different varieties. That's kind of what I've picked up a little bit on. Any suggestion for cover or companion crop for asparagus? I think in that situation, depend on what you're after. If you are, since they're not going to need germination, you're not going to need any sort of pollinators to come in, you probably don't need a companion plant that flowers. That would be my best guess with that. You might consider maybe some companions that maybe provide some nitrogen to the soil, especially as the rhizome underneath is going to be moving and growing different directions. So maybe putting some kind of leguminous crop around might be beneficial. So maybe you put your row of green beans, or you put kind of those peas, even cool season peas, might put some nitrogen back into the soil. That might be the one companion that I might suggest is either one of them. You might also even think about putting some rows of radishes on either side. And the reason for that is that radishes sometimes have potential to address compaction in the soil, and that might really help the rhizome. So both of my suggestions are related to soil, is what I would say for companion plants. How do you lightly cultivate asparagus after harvest? Yeah, this is one where you have to be very mindful of. You might come in with kind of a bit of a tool to kind of get around some of that rhizome, just slightly, some of the weeds, but it can be very troublesome and very hard to do any sort of cultivation, especially after that harvest period. You also still want that fern to be developing too. So you might decide to do cultivation of the weeds early in the season, and then later, once the asparagus has begun being harvested from, and you have a fern develop, you might get into more hand pooling more than anything. You might also even consider, when that fern develops, this might be a good time to put maybe, if you can, put maybe some mulch around the asparagus to block out any of those weeds that might be growing. That might be what I suggest. Yep, and then your follow-up question, when's the best time of year to mulch asparagus? I would say that it might be later in the season, now that I think about it, because you could get away with addressing some of the weed pressure early in the season, but later in the season, you might lose that opportunity. So maybe later in the season with some straw mulch might be a good time to do some mulching for it. There was a statement, extension told me to cut ferns when brown late in the year to prevent beetles from overwintering. I would agree with that, Geraldine. I think that that would be a great opportunity, is to cut them down late in the year. That's going to prevent any of that overwintering of the beetles, especially because we just don't have as much guidance as far as how to really control the beetles. And that's where they tend to kind of overwinter and hang out. There was a statement about discovered wild ramps all over a wooded hillside behind my house. Yeah, carefully harvest, leaving roots behind, but very good. And that might be where, as much as it's going to take 8 years to get a ramp harvest, you might find that it's worth it, is to do it. And there's more out there as far as how much to leave behind when it comes to the ramps, but certainly that might be a group that you just try it out and, wait about 8 years for harvest from. Question, anything you can do for Japanese beetles on rhubarb? So that's one where it's a little bit tricky to control because they certainly will build up population. Most of the time, the recommendation is to try to knock them into a bucket of soapy water early in the morning on those rhubarb leaves. I would also, I don't think I would put a row cover on them. I don't think that would be beneficial. You might find too that you maybe need to divide the rhubarb early that year, just because that maybe could reduce some of the pressure of Japanese beetles as well. So they just don't have as much leaf material. But certainly we know that that can be a problem. There's not as many good recommendations, but I would say that any of those general recommendations for Japanese beetle control would work pretty well for your rhubarb plants. Will deer bother rhubarb and horseradish? Most times they're not going to. I don't think they are going to really target the horseradish, especially because of the growth that it exhibits. I kind of doubt that they're going to do it with rhubarb as well. I think there's other things for them to find with it, and probably just the shape of the leaf is also something that they're not really too interested. Others may know more than I do, though. The rhubarb experience I have, we've got to see deer, but this year could be it. There was a question. My dad said that his rhubarb could be harvested all summer. I'm thinking that was wrong. I would be a little limited with it. Yet again, it gets back to how old your rhubarb patch is. And as some of y'all have shared, you have very old rhubarb patches. And if you have been harvesting all summer long, I think that might be okay. I think the hesitation there might be if you have maybe one of those newer varieties where they really are looking for 10 to 12 weeks of harvest. If you've been doing it for, 45 years, 24 years, however old your rhubarb patch is, I think you're probably okay with continuing to do that. But if you're putting a new one out, one of these new varieties, I would go by the guidance of 10 to 12 weeks. Keeps growing. So any additional questions? I know we're about to hit time, but I just want to make sure we get all these questions answered. So there was a question. Someone told me that after the first harvest, the rest was poison. I don't know what you mean, Tina. So like the actual kind of petioles, perhaps, are poison. It tends to not be the case with this. We've not heard anything about that. And there's kind of some old myths as well that later in the season that the oxalic acid. Yeah, I see what you're saying. The oxalic potentially. There was some older kind of thoughts that a later harvest of rhubarb later in the season would sometimes move the oxalic acid to the stalks, and yet that's not the case with it. And it could also be the rhizome too. So someone else has mentioned the rhizome is poison. So yeah, that could possibly be what they're kind of getting at, that you wouldn't actually harvest it. There was a question, where the heck does one get aged manure compost? Yeah, you've heard me use that a lot tonight, this aged manure. We do, aged manure is typically what you might find at the home and garden center, where it's in the bag, or it has been even something that you would find in at home and garden centers and order a yard, if you will. This is what we mean by aged manure, where it has gone through some kind of process where it has become a little bit more composted. So anything like that from a home and garden center, whether it's a bag or whether it's by the yard, that's typically what we consider aged manure. The raw manure, of course, is straight from the field, usually less than 90 days is that raw manure. So we always are recommending composted or aged manure. Final question for the night. Why twist and pull rather than cut the rhubarb? Either one is fine. We just find that it's just a little bit easier to do that twist and pull rather than just do a full cut. I don't think you're really going to do as much damage as you would, say, asparagus if you had a knife and we're kind of cutting through it. So it's kind of up to you. We just find that folks will the twist and pull is a little bit easier to do more than anything. All right. Well, thanks for joining us tonight. Yet again, it's going to be recorded. We'll make sure you have the link tomorrow morning. I will send you some additional resources so that you have these going forward. Good luck with rhubarb asparagus season right now. Horseradish season perhaps is here. I myself, as you see, I've got rhubarb and horseradish to plant probably this weekend. So have a good night. Hope